Major spoiler alert for 5.0 to 5.3 Natlan Archon Quest. Please click away if you haven't played and want to experience it for yourself. Alright. I know. This video is just gonna be a whole bunch of copium and hopium for all of us who wishes that this fine specimen of a man would eventually arise from his stupid idiot comatose or soul is gone whatever state and will grace his presence within our party comps. But hey, we can all have our bits of dreams, and honestly, I have quite a few speculations on some methods Hoyo might plan to use, and with my refusal to look at any leaks, I'm just gonna go into this video with the assumption that there is still that little bit of a chance. Basically, I'm just gonna look at our options and see how the game can make sense of his return, both in the lore and story sense of things and in the gameplay sense of things. Alright, let's start considering things from a story perspective first. Starting with the most popular theories that I've seen being thrown around, which relies on the notion that Capitano isn't actually dead and is rather on a suspended state of existence that he would eventually thaw out of. This is actually a decently reasonable assumption to make, in part because of two things. One is that if you were to go to the throne of primal fire that Capitano sits on and observed his body, everyone and their mother would notice that the donkey man is still very much breathing. While yes, he is practically immobile and that it was stated that he was never to move from that seat, this makes for a decent case where we can't just outright assume that he is dead. The second more detailed contributor to this suggestion has everything to do with how the story of Natlan is progressing and has progressed, and how Genshin itself has portrayed death throughout the retelling of the main present storyline. While Capitano played an integral role in the grand scheme of Natlan's Archon quest, some might argue that his overall direct presence throughout the happenings of the quest itself were rather lacking, especially compared to the frequency of appearances and screen time that we see from previous Harbingers who end up forming some sort of an extended relationship with the Traveler, such as Child, Skara, and Arlecchino. Then Capitano's range of actual interactions with us doesn't actually spell that many minutes, though we can attribute this to him having his own "I wanna rest the souls of my hundreds of comrades" thing behind the scenes, making it so that he spent more time away from our eyes to make sure this plan comes into fruition. It is also usually a telltale sign in Genshin storytelling that there will still be more that Capitano will contribute to in the coming patches storylines. This is the kind of pattern that we saw with Scaramouche, where we get teasers of him for the Meteor events, then a tad bit more in the Inazuma Archon quest, before we get him coming in big time on the latter stages of the Sumeru Archon quest, whilst also not having him becoming an entirely main state presence within that Archon quest itself. It was only after the main arc of the Sumeru Archon quest where we finally get more of a complete exposition to Scaramouche's existence, and we get to see how he can provide us with some more knowledge of the world, which ended up having more to do with how Irminsul affects Tevat. I think Hoyo has the option of gearing up Capitano to go and have that sort of role for the Traveler, considering his status and first-hand knowledge as a Conrian elite regarding the Fallen Nation and our sibling, and his role within the War of the Cataclysm. It would simply be wasteful for Hoyo to not even consider this route to begin with, and quite frankly, I have every confidence to think that they have this very sort of function in mind for Capitano from the very beginning. Think about it, when it comes to Genshin in particular, Hoyo has always been very strict when it comes to showcasing major character deaths, and making sure that there is no room for interpretation that could make people think about whether or not a certain character whose deaths were supposed to be absolute be anything else other than that. First case in point, Senora. Though it probably broke the hearts of so many people to see her go down, Hoyo made sure that everyone who saw that scene knows for a certain that Senora is just dead in all caps. We saw her get slashed out of existence in supreme fashion, turn into literal ash, and just disappear right in front of our eyes. To make it sink even deeper, they dedicated an entire animated short that revolves around the Harbingers honoring her death, and a coffin that showcases her butterflies that really nails that message of Senora is completely dead. Another example, Halfdan. Man, in terms of seeing a body turn limp and lifeless, his final few seconds of screen time during the Chasm Interlude quest is a pretty freaking good example of that very thing happening. Tainslev talks of his sacrifice and his soul pretty much dissipating afterwards was even more of a showcase to solidify that notion. Even when it comes to lesser NPCs such as Tepe and Abetui, they made sure to confirm to us that those people are dead and gone. there's nothing that leaves it up to our interpretation and is just outright stated. Now, some of you writing nerds might think, well, that's bad storytelling because you're going against the whole show don't tell rule, but in the case of gacha communities and accounting for their unique reading comprehension, the devs do often find that they need to tell, or else people are just gonna overthink the lore and try to find ways to justify those characters still being alive. And yes, I am fully calling myself out with that one. No need to write it in the comments. In Capitano's case, however, while Mavuika herself has stated that she considers him to have fallen and have sacrificed himself, Auroron, Citlali, and the Lord of the Night provided subtle cues that might indicate that the man's state of existence is not as simple as we might think. Auroron acknowledges that Capitano's curse of immortality still exists. It was the one thing that was unchangeable after all, since Renova could not afford and was unwilling to go against a curse that was placed upon him by the heavenly principles themselves. Auroron categorizes Capitano's state of suspension as that of just literally being frozen on the throne, while Citlali states that he had fused his existence with that of the Lord of the Night. And for me, the biggest clue came from the Lord of the Night herself, who when asked by Mavuika to confirm if the captain was still with them, instead of just outright saying, "Nah, he do be gone," she mentions that there is no need to pursue traces of him, since it's best to just let immortals bask in the release from their mortal coil as it is their greatest form of peace. But that might insinuate that his soul and traces are indeed somewhere in there, instead of fully dissipating into nothingness. And there are either methods or situations where his soul could indeed come to present itself. One of those methods is a cool theory described by the redditor NoArdvark8584, which revolves around the system of offering blazing flint ores to the throne of the primordial flame. The throne's description states that in this place, another human hero has frozen life and death, here forever to remain. Meanwhile, the blazing flint ores that we offer, apart from having the obvious mechanic of upgrading the Pyro Traveler's constellations, is also described to have the ability to emit a fiery pulse and would one day emit a gentle gleam that illuminates the night. Whether it would mean that the Traveler would be able to free Capitano through the proxy of becoming the new light that Capitano is sort of serving for the Night Kingdom at the moment, or that the fire that the flint ores emit will end up slowly thawing Capitano out of his suspended state, are two neat scenarios in this situation. Another thing related to the Night Kingdom that gives Capitano that avenue of return is to just see what Xbalanque was able to do in order to return to Natlan for a day. While it is obvious that he was only able to do that due to his bet with Renova, he also mentions that there are unique scenarios where certain life forces can be used to bring back souls from the Night Kingdom for a certain period of time. And with how the governance of the Night Kingdom have somewhat changed due to Yohualtekutin's new understanding of human governance, maybe there can be situations where the angel herself deems it necessary for Capitano to make his return. What those situations would be are pretty much pure speculation at this point. But with the Tory beginning to have some sort of presence in Natlan and his willingness to leverage anything when it comes to gaining any form of further knowledge, there may be a situation where him messing around with Natlan's recovering ley lines, or with him using some sort of insanely underhanded methods to get his hands on Mavuika's gnosis, would force the Lord of the Night to utilize Capitano in some shape or form. With Capitano's sense of honor, I'd be honestly kinda disappointed if the Tory's unsavory methods doesn't spark any sort of resistance within his soul. It'll be an interesting plot point to see someone who has Capitano's sense of justice come up against another Harbinger's scrupulous methods, especially now that if Capitano ever returns, his responsibility of obtaining the Gnosis would have been null. In a purely gameplay perspective, however, his entry into being a playable character may give players a bit of a sour taste, with one of the suggestions focusing on the notion of his playable form being the manifestation of a copy made from the story of Thrain. Just like how Guthrith's soul and story persists throughout Natlan, it isn't far-fetched to say that the same can now be said about Thrain. Even more so with the mural of his sacrifice now being known to most of Natlan. That being said, from what I've seen from many parts of the community, this isn't a possibility that everyone is really too keen on seeing, since it might create this sense of hollowness of not actually playing and being the character that we wanted to pull for all along. It is also to say that the whole other notion of his playable form just, being an existence that is detached from his death status in the lore is something that isn't exactly a thing that Hoyo does when it specifically comes to Genshin. I'm well aware that in Honkai Impact, that there are plenty of playable battle suits that are from characters who have died in the story's past, and in Star Rail we actually have playable characters who were released and then died in the game, being Gallagher and Misha. We also have two characters who died and are then revived in some shape or form, being Shui Yi and of course Tingyun or Fugue. But when it comes to Genshin, we have not once saw this become an outright occurrence for playable characters. The closest we had was Kara's attempt at erasing his existence from Irminsul, but that would also not have counted as an outright death even if he had succeeded. So I doubt Hoyo would take this path if Capitano ever becomes playable. Another point of resistance that I saw was that should Capitano become playable through some sort of story revival thing, then why didn't Signora get the same treatment? For me, the answer is simple. Signora just simply doesn't have a story anymore and had already fulfilled her purpose in the plot. Everything that has to do with her character's lore has been kind of lost in the past, while Capitano still has major Conria involvements to think about. Plus, as much as I wanted Signora to be playable, I understood that she was supposed to be the type of Fatui that signifies their pure ruthlessness, seeing as she already completely forsook who she was in the past, with all her present ideals and goals being only for the Tsaritsa and no one else. And while you can argue that she briefly remembered who she was when she entered the Crimson Witch mode in the fight against us, there was no trace of it left the moment she reverted back to her cryo-suppressed self. Capitano just still has way more of a play within the lore itself, while I think Signora has duly accomplished everything that the story has set her out to do. That and, she's basically Ash now. Kinda hard to bring that back to life as opposed to a dude whose whole sitting comma ass is still right there for us to see. And that's about it. I think the general consensus when it comes to Capitano's state in this game is that while a lot of people definitely would want for him to eventually be playable, we would want Hoyo to achieve that whilst also making it so that it doesn't compromise and devalue all the things that had already happened in Natlan's Archon Quest. Personally, I don't care how they do it, I just think he'd be sick to play as, but as a lore enjoyer, it would be much cooler if they can achieve that in a way that makes sense plot-wise as well. Thanks for giving this a watch. Hope you guys enjoyed this and feel free to let me know what your thoughts are in the comments down below. And also, feel free to give my Twitch a follow. I'm starting up some streams soon, so come on and drop by if you feel like it. Until the next video, the name's Leafy, and I'll see y'all next time. Sayonara.